Now, in the book's foreword, Desmond Tutu asks, when will the people of the Holy Land be ready for peace?
Well, we try in a way to look into that question also in our introduction. And first of all, I don't think if you take the book as a whole, the different contributors have different opinions on that. That was part of the idea with the book. This is not a book where everyone agrees. But my view is that yes, there is a possibility or a way out, but there are certain conditions that has to be fulfilled. And I guess the most important is that the two parties, I mean Israel and Palestine, the Israelis and the Palestinians, they will have to recognize each other's right to exist on an equal level. I mean, what's happened with the Oslo Agreement was that was a recognition. I mean, the Palestinians, PLO, recognized the right of Israel to exist, and Israel recognized PLO as representative of the Palestinians, which is not an equal recognition. And I think this equality in recognizing each other and not labeling each other as this or that terrorist or whatever, as long as you continue doing that, you undermine the possibility of any kind of fruitful peace negotiations or settlement. So the two parties will have to see that they both have to, in a way, accept each other and each other's equal rights. And the international community will have to do the same. I mean, what we see today is that a lot of the international community, they recognize the Ramallah government of the Palestinians, while they refuse to have anything to do with the Hamas government that actually won the election in 2006. There won't be any Palestinian reconciliation with such an international positioning, and as a consequence, you will not reach any kind of peaceful solution. So there is a lot of changes that has to happen in the international community, and as well as among the Israelis and the Palestinians. I had, prior to this book, some interesting interviews with some Israeli officers that had been serving. One of them was the one that actually led the retake or the capturing of Shofak, the suburb of East Jerusalem in 1967. And I mean, he said he was not on the Palestinian side, but he said, we just have to accept that they are a people, we are a people, and the only way out of this is that we give this mutual recognition and that way form the base for a two-state solution. There is a possibility, but there are certain changes that has to happen, and they are quite profound and obviously very difficult to reach.
Can the situation be resolved when Israel repeatedly continues to build more settlements on Palestinian land?
Well, you say it's not the first time. It's happened repeatedly since 67, or actually you can roll the line back to 48 also, when it happened in 48, 49, as Ilan Pater has written about in his book, Ethnic Cleansing. To my understanding, the international community is very much to blame here, because one has again and again accepted violation of international treaties, conventions, this and that. I have often said during my time working in the Palestinian territory or in Palestine from 2000 to 2003 that, I mean, what is happening in that area is the most devastating attack on all kinds of international conventions, because it's a continuous undermining of their validity.
Why this blatant international complacency?
You can compare it to similar or not even as bad violations other places in the world. We very often see the international community ready to step in one or another way with I mean, I don't support military interventions, but to use economic sanctions, other kind of pressure to actually force parties to follow international conventions, to abide by international human rights resolutions, etc., etc., etc. And what my experience during my stay in Palestine was that what's happening down there is what is undermining the reality or the worth of these conventions, because it's continuously undermined, it's continuously broken, and I think this way the international community actually ends up with total lack of some kind of an international governance, which we have been talking about and working to get for decades, knowing that this is much more globalized world than it was 100 years ago. And so what happens in that area is actually moving us backward. And I think this is a challenge for governments all over, and till today they don't live up to it. They don't take that responsibility. They react certain places with violence and harsh measures, and other places like Israel, Palestine, they are very, very reluctant to make too much pressure. Pressure in words, but they don't follow it up in deeds.
In April 2013, so just a few months ago, as you point out in your introduction, the U.S. President Barack Obama, on an official visit to Israel, omitted any mention of its illegal colonies. When will the U.S. be an honest broker in this conflict?
The U.S. is the big power in many ways, but at the same time, obviously, if you're following the news, you get clear indications that the U.S. influence in the Middle East is being reduced. It's also about the whole discussion of the U.S. Dependency on oil and gas from the Middle East. Is that also decreasing, given all the new possibilities that they are exploring in the United States and in the American, that part of the world, which would make the U.S. more self-supplied with these kind of raw material. But so of course that might change the equation. The other issue which is raised by Laura Lewis in her article is the role of the neo-Christian environment in the US, which she points at is much more important when it comes to influencing the Congress in the US than the Jewish lobby. And that's also an interesting aspect of this conflict, because these neo-Christian groups, we also have them in Europe. You have all these figures that are actually living as if they are going to be part of a new era down there, and then this influences a lot of the public in different parts of the world, the United States not the least, but also in Europe, and they are willing to do whatever economically, and also Americans who are actually they are populating the most conservative settlements of the West Bank is populated by Americans that are there more or less on rotation. So I think we have to, in a way, we have focused very much on the Jewish lobby, but I think we have to, in a way, broaden our view here and look at different aspects of why is the position of the US today as it is. And there are possibilities for change, but again, it takes time. And of course, the rise of other big powers in the world will also change the US possibility to be the main broker. The question is if China or India and so on will be ready to go in and play a different role. That is not given. Can
you explain briefly how Norway became the peace broker in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and how you got involved in this book?
There is one of our contributors, Hilde Henriksen-Våg. She's a professor in history. She's the one that has been writing the most about the Norwegian role in these peace negotiations. I mean, the whole thing started out back after the Second World War with very, very, very close contacts between Norway and the Social Democratic Party in Israel. And these contacts has been there ever since. In the beginning, and actually up till 1980s, beginning of the 90s, they were very, there was not much criticism or critical views about Israel and Israeli policies in it. I mean, it's known that Norway actually managed to send heavy water to Israel. That was the foundation of the Mona and so on, together with the French. I mean, there's a lot of history here. But then also Norway, through its diplomatic services, step by step in Lebanon, developed contacts with the PLO. So it seems that Norway actually then had the very close connections with Israel and Israeli political circles, especially the Social Democratic Party. And then they established step by step during the 70s and 80s links with the PLO. This was partly also due to quite a strong pro-Palestinian solidarity movement in Norway that actually helped in moving the Norwegian public from being very pro-Israel to today being very pro-Palestinian. Of course, also the Norwegian soldiers that served in Lebanon. There were several 10,000 of soldiers that were in total serving in Lebanon. They also came back with experiences that also formed or changed the Norwegian public opinion. So in total, all these things form the base for Norway, having links with both and being some kind of an impartial role compared to the Madrid negotiations where the US played a crucial role. So I guess that is at least main elements of the story, how Norway got into it. And Norway had already some experiences from Guatemala and so on in being some kind of a peace negotiator or facilitator of peace negotiations. So Norway developed those skills as a tiny small country with sufficient economic means to be able to, in a way, back these kind of political initiatives. Well, I have not been involved in anything related to the Oslo Accords because, I was recruited as the deputy head of the Norwegian representative office to the Palestinians starting my service there in January 2000. So before that, actually, I had quite a limited focus on the Palestinian territory. I was responsible for the development cooperation with the Palestinians. And as the deputy head, I then also stayed half the week in Gaza, half the week in the West Bank, and had actually then contacts, also political contacts in Gaza with the different political fractions during the years 2000 to 2003. Mm-hmm. So that is my background. So I have not been part of anything related to the negotiations when it comes to the Oslo Accords and what has been in following up on it. But of course, I've had contacts with a lot of Palestinians that has been involved in different aspects of the following up or the lack of following up of these accords. So that way, I've got a lot of feedbacks, impressions that actually is the base for why this idea of the book came up.
Going back to the book, prominent Israeli author Ilan Pappé writes that in 1948, and I quote, half of the country's native population was expelled, half of its villages and towns were destroyed, and 80% of mandatory Palestine became the Jewish state of Israel. Now, all this under the eyes of the international community. How much more dispossession of the Palestinian people has become acceptable since then?
What is very interesting with the essay on Petter Bauck is also that he brings up a lot of historical issues related to what extent was that all the intentions with the Oslo Accord possible to follow up on. Has the Israeli political circles had a position all the time back from 1948 about a continuous grabbing more land, keeping the territory, even occupied territories like Bantustans or whatever. Has this been a policy that's actually been living all the way through? And that this is not a new situation, it's just that we see more of it openly now. And I think actually we are back to the first question about, what the international community are willing to accept. Because what we see is that the Israelis are just pushing borders forward. They are doing new things, and then they get some kind of silent acceptance. It doesn't mean that the international community agree, but they don't make any kind of fierce protests, reactions like economic boycotts or whatever. That is always not fruitful when it comes to Israel and Israel-Palestine, while it's looked upon as a fruitful way of reacting when it's, for example, apartheid regime in South Africa. So there's a lot of double standards here, and of course the Palestinians are the ones that are losing out all the time. It was quite an I had an interesting dinner a couple of years ago with one of the ministers in the government in Ramallah, and his clear position was that the situation goes towards war. It goes towards a third intifada. And he said a third intifada will be very different from the first and the second. This time we will go out with our grandmothers, mothers, children, because we have nothing to lose. And this is a very, very sensible guy. He's not radical in any way. But this was his feeling that, hey, now we just have to give everything. And because it's a question of survival or extinction. And I think this desperation is there. And of course, when you then have circles in Israel that still are arguing that they should force the Palestinians to Jordan, because Jordan is the Palestinian state, etc., etc. Of course, this adds to a feeling of desperation among the Palestinians, and I think that is also what the international community should be aware of, that what is happening is just creating the base for more and more unrest and not willingness to make any kind of compromises, because you don't see any good things coming out of being willing to compromise. I think that was my feeling when I was there, that Palestinians felt more and more like, hey, we are just giving away, but we get nothing back.
In his chapter, Mats Gilbert, who's a Norwegian doctor who worked in a hospital in Gaza in 2009, describes quite graphically some of the horrendous violations committed by the Israeli army on Palestinians. When will Israeli impunity end?
It was interesting, before you called today, I looked up on Al Jazeera, and there is one of the headlines in Al Jazeera today is that finally the government in Sri Lanka has given the the human rights commissioner of the UN green light to go to Sri Lanka to have a 1-week fact-finding mission on what has actually happened in the north and the northeast. And it's also said in that article that this is partly a result of the Canadians threatening to boycott the Commonwealth meeting that's supposed to take part in Colombo later this year, I think, or next year. So then suddenly you see that, hey, international reactions force the government to actually open up for this type of investigations. We saw, I was in Palestine when the atrocities in the Jenin refugee camp happened in 2002. I was among the 3 first internationals that came into Jenin after the Israelis left. They left in the night, and we came in early in the morning to work with the governor to actually organize the international influx into Benin after the horrendous attacks. But then you saw how the Israelis treated that issue of what kind of investigations to be made and what had actually happened. And the same also after the war in Gaza in 2008, 2009. So again, we are back to the question of international coherence in a way, in the way of acting, that you upheld the principles, and you also, you put everyone, be it Israel or Sri Lanka or whoever, responsible, so that they are actually forced to follow up on these conventions.